Disclaimer. What happened in Venezuela didn't feel like the beginning of something new. It felt sudden, almost routine, like another geopolitical shock in a world that no longer reacts the way it once did. A rapid operation followed by a leadership collapse and a transfer of control that most people processed as a political headline before moving on with their day. That reaction is exactly why moments like this matter, because events that reshape history rarely announce themselves as turning points. They disguise themselves as maintenance, as cleanup, as necessity, unfolding quietly in familiar language while their real consequences develop slowly and then arrive all at once. What unfolded in Venezuela wasn't really about ideology, morality, or even oil in the way most people think about oil. It was a signal that a much larger mechanism is already in motion, a mechanism that has repeated itself so consistently across history that once you learn to recognize it, you stop asking whether it will happen again and start asking where you are inside it. Right now, the United States sits at the most dangerous point in that mechanism, not because of a single administration or policy choice, but because of accumulated decisions layered over decades, the kind that feel harmless when viewed individually but become catastrophic when combined. Empires don't collapse because they lose battles. They collapse because their internal math stops working. For more than 2,000 years, every dominant power has followed the same arc. The names change, the technologies evolve, the scale expands, but the structure never does, and that structure is ruthless in its consistency. It always begins the same way. A disciplined system of value, a currency that represents something real, a population rewarded for productivity rather than proximity to power. Trade expands because trust exists. Capital flows in because rules are predictable, and innovation accelerates because effort is rewarded. This is the phase later generations romanticize, the golden age, the era everyone wishes they had lived through. Yet embedded inside that success is the seed of its own destruction. As wealth accumulates, priorities shift. Expansion feels justified, infrastructure grows, social guarantees multiply, and military commitments extend beyond borders. At first, all of it is affordable because it's funded by genuine surplus. The system still works, people feel safer, life gets easier, and expectations rise. Then something subtle happens. Spending begins to outpace production, not dramatically or visibly, but just enough to matter over time. And at this stage, no one panics because it often feels like progress. The empire appears strong, the currency remains trusted, borrowing feels safe, growth seems endless, and obligations pile up under the assumption they can always be handled later. Later is where the trap closes. Maintaining dominance is far more expensive than achieving it. Protecting trade routes costs more than building them. Policing allies costs more than defeating enemies, and political promises cost more than political victories. Eventually, revenue stops keeping up. Raising taxes becomes politically toxic. Cutting spending becomes socially impossible, and default is unthinkable. So empires choose the same option every time because it feels painless at first. They weaken the currency. In ancient times, rulers shaved precious metals from coins. Today, currency is created digitally, but the effect is identical. More claims on the same real economy, more money chasing the same goods. At first, this looks like relief. Obligations are met. Growth continues. Markets stay calm. But something invisible begins to fracture. Trust. Those closest to the system notice first. Foreign holders, large institutions, sophisticated capital, and they don't panic. They diversify quietly, and this is the point of no return because once trust erodes, it never returns all at once. As currency credibility weakens, the behavior of the empire changes, and this is where most people misunderstand what they're seeing. The response is not retreat, it is aggression. When paper claims lose strength, empires seek things that cannot be printed. Land, energy, minerals, infrastructure, strategic assets, anything with intrinsic value. This is where military power stops being about defense and starts being about acquisition, regardless of the language used to justify it. This is why Venezuela matters. Not because of who was in charge or what was said, but because of what Venezuela represents in a world where financial credibility is thinning. It sits on an enormous concentration of real physical energy that cannot be diluted by policy and that backs modern civilization itself. When an empire under strain reaches outward for assets like this, it is not signaling strength, it is signaling timing. This behavior doesn't stabilize the system, it delays consequences, and delay is dangerous because it allows internal pressures to compound. While attention focuses outward, something else accelerates inward. Prices rise faster than wages, savings lose purchasing power, debt grows heavier, and the middle class, which depends on stability, feels squeezed from both sides. Wealth stops being something you earn and becomes something you defend. This is when social cohesion weakens, politics polarize, blame replaces accountability, and the conversation shifts from growth to survival. It doesn't feel like collapse, it feels like confusion. People sense something is wrong but can't name it. They're told everything is under control while their lived experience contradicts the reassurance, and this is when capital begins to move, not emotionally, but strategically. Wealth migration doesn't happen because of fear. It happens because of pattern recognition. Those with resources study history not out of curiosity, but necessity. Understanding that once systems reach this stage, options narrow quickly. That's why capital relocates before controls appear, why assets shift before rules change, and why exits fill long before alarms sound. History confirms this with brutal consistency. Rome didn't collapse overnight. Its currency dissolved slowly, and then suddenly, prices exploded, trade seized, wealth consolidated into land and hard assets, and those holding currency were destroyed. The Dutch didn't lose dominance in a single war. Debt, overextension, and loss of confidence hollowed their system until leadership passed quietly to the next power. Britain's decline unfolded over decades. The pound didn't vanish, it faded, and that fade devastated those who believed reserve status guaranteed permanence. Every empire believed it was different. None were. What makes the current moment unique is scale. Never before has a single currency sat at the center of global trade, debt, and reserves the way it does today. That dominance created extraordinary privilege, but it also magnified the eventual adjustment. When reserve systems weaken, the transfer is not linear but asymmetric. Losses concentrate, gains consolidate, which is why this transition will likely be remembered as the largest wealth transfer in history, not because of a single event, but because a cycle is reaching maturity. The operation in Venezuela didn't start this process, it exposed it. It revealed that the system has entered the phase where credibility alone is no longer sufficient, where force is used to secure what trust once guaranteed. That is not a prediction, it is a pattern. And patterns don't ask permission before finishing. What happens next is the phase most people never prepare for, not because it's hidden, but because it unfolds slowly enough to be dismissed and fast enough to become irreversible once yes, finally recognized. After confidence begins to weaken, behavior changes before belief does. People still say they trust the system, but they stop acting like it, shortening timelines, prioritizing liquidity over loyalty, and quietly reducing exposure without speeches or announcements. This is not panic. Panic comes later. This is calculation. Currencies do not collapse when everyone loses faith. They collapse when enough people decide they don't need to hold as much of them anymore, and that shift is already underway. Trade agreements quietly change structure, reserves subtly rebalance, financial institutions hedge in ways they didn't before, and governments continue speaking the language of stability, even as policy becomes reactive instead of strategic, with the system managing symptoms rather than causes. This is where the math turns unforgiving. Debt compounds. Whether confidence exists or not, interest accumulates regardless of narratives. And at a certain point, obligations grow faster than the economy that must service them, narrowing choices to two paths, both destructive. Rates can rise, preserving the currency at the cost of solvency, or rates can stay low, preserving solvency at the cost of the currency, and once this threshold is crossed, there is no third option. This is the moment central banks lose independence in practice, even if not in name. Monetary policy stops being about price stability and becomes about debt survival, and the system bends inward. Historically, this is where volatility becomes structural instead of cyclical. Markets stop moving on fundamentals alone and begin reacting to credibility shocks, where small events trigger outsized reactions because confidence is thin. For everyday people, this phase feels like instability without explanation. Prices fluctuate, rules change, long-term planning becomes difficult, and promises that once felt permanent begin to feel conditional. This is not collapse yet, this is compression. And compression always precedes rupture. What makes this stage so dangerous is that it creates the illusion of time. Systems can survive here for years, sometimes decades, depending on how much credibility remains, and that illusion convinces people adjustment will be gradual and manageable. History shows otherwise. When the final break comes, it rarely arrives politely. It comes through inflation that accelerates faster than wages can adjust, or through restructuring that wipes out claims once considered untouchable, and sometimes through both. This is when stored paper wealth disappears without being stolen. No invasion, no confiscation, just math asserting itself. And this is where the wealth transfer completes. It does not transfer wealth neatly from one country to another. It transfers wealth between behaviors, between those who prepared and those who assumed continuity, between those who held claims and those who held things. Every major reset in history has rewarded the same categories. Tangible assets survive monetary transitions because they do not rely on trust in a system to exist. Land produces food regardless of the currency used to price it. Energy powers civilization regardless of the unit of account. Productive businesses adapt, and skills retain value because they solve real problems. What fails are abstractions that require stability to maintain worth. This is why, during every major monetary reset, savings are destroyed while capability endures. People who can produce, repair, build, heal, or grow something retain agency, while those who depend entirely on fixed claims do not. This is not ideology, it is observation. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this phase is time. Many assume that because collapse is not immediate, preparation can wait, yet that assumption has ruined more fortunes than panic ever has. The correct moment to act is not when fear is obvious, but when denial is widespread. And right now, denial still dominates the public conversation, which alone tells you where we are in the cycle. This is also the phase where restrictions begin to sound reasonable. Controls are framed as temporary, measures are justified as protective, and language softens reality, even though history shows that once such measures appear, they rarely disappear voluntarily, instead expanding, normalizing, and hardening. Those who understand this pattern do not wait for permission to adapt. They create optionality early, when it is still legal, affordable, and quiet, because optionality is the single most valuable asset in late-stage systems. It means flexibility of residence, income, assets, and skills. It means avoiding single points of failure and building resilience without dependence on benevolence. This is why capital moves before crises, not after. Once the crowd recognizes the danger, the exits are already congested. If you're still watching this, it means you're trying to understand something most people avoid confronting, and that alone puts you ahead of the curve. And if this perspective is helping you see the bigger picture more clearly, take a moment now to support the channel. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay connected. Because this story is unfolding in real time, and understanding the signals early is the difference between reacting late and positioning intelligently. The hardest part of all this is psychological, not financial. Humans are wired to expect continuity. We extrapolate the present forward because it feels safe, assuming institutions that have existed our entire lives will continue in the same form. And every generation that lived through a reset believed that too. Resets do not require the collapse of civilization. They require the collapse of assumptions. The world does not end. It reorganizes. And those who cling to old frameworks suffer most, while those who adapt early shape what comes next. The coming transition will not look like a single dramatic event. It will look like a series of rational responses to growing constraints, each step making sense in isolation, with the full pattern only becoming obvious in hindsight, by which point positioning options will be limited. This is why understanding cycles matters more than predicting dates. Timelines vary, structures do not. When systems prioritize spending over productivity long enough, the resolution is never painless, but it is survivable for those who respect history instead of dismissing it. The greatest mistake people make when confronted with this reality is paralysis, assuming preparation requires extreme action or perfect foresight. It does not. It requires diversification of risk, not abandonment of life, awareness, not panic, and an understanding that stability is not binary. It erodes gradually, then rapidly. Small adjustments made early outperform dramatic moves made late. History is generous with warnings and ruthless with consequences. What we are witnessing now is not the end of anything, but the middle of a transition that has played out many times before with the same underlying mechanics. The wealth transfer is not a theory. It is a process already underway. The only variable left is participation. Most people will experience it passively, a smaller group will experience it deliberately, and a very small group will understand it in advance. Not because of intelligence or income, but because of a willingness to confront uncomfortable patterns and act before consensus forms. That window does not close suddenly, it narrows quietly. And once it closes, history does not reopen it. If you stay aware, adaptable, and grounded in reality rather than reassurance, you give yourself the greatest advantage possible in uncertain times. This is not about fear, it is about clarity. And clarity, when used early, is power.